To understand what Canada lost, you have to understand what Canada built. In 1877, James Glenn Cockshutt established the Cockshutt Plough Company in the city of Brantford, Ontario, a manufacturing town that already understood steel and agriculture in its bones. Brantford sat at the confluence of practical geography, close to the steel of Hamilton, surrounded by some of the most fertile mixed farmland in the Dominion, and connected by rail to the grain farms of the prairies that were, by the 1880s, opening at a rate that no existing implement manufacturer could fully supply.
James Cockshutt did not set out to build a tractor company. He set out to build plows. And for 30 years, Cockshutt plows were among the most respected implements on the Canadian frontier. The walking plow, the gang plow, the disc plow, Cockshutt manufactured them with a consistency that earned the company a reputation that Canadian farmers held close. They build things right in Brantford.
The company expanded deliberately, not recklessly, deliberately. In 1928, recognizing that the age of horse-drawn implements was ending and the age of mechanical power was arriving on the prairies with the force of a weather system, Cockshutt entered the tractor business. The first machine they offered under their own badge was not, strictly speaking, manufactured entirely in Brantford. Cockshutt had the practical Canadian sense to source their drivetrain components efficiently. But the iron, the assembly, the testing, and the warranty, that was Brantford. What put Cockshutt on every serious farm in Ontario, Manitoba, Saskatchewan, and Alberta was not any single mechanical breakthrough. It was something rarer. A reputation for doing what was necessary rather than what was fashionable.
What happened next was the decision that every implement dealer from Lethbridge to London, Ontario had been waiting for since the end of the Second World War. And when it arrived not as a single tractor, but as a complete, radical rethinking of what a Canadian farm machine ought to be. In 1949, Cockshutt released the Model 30, and with it, everything changed.
The Model 30 was not merely a tractor. It was a declaration of philosophy. At a time when virtually every major North American tractor manufacturer was still building machines that required the engine to run at a fixed RPM in order to maintain the standardized 540 RPM power takeoff speed, which meant a farmer running light load work was still burning fuel at full throttle, Cockshutt engineered something the industry had not yet bothered to provide: a live, independent power takeoff.
The Cockshutt 30's PTO ran independently of the transmission. A farmer could stop the tractor, change gears, even disengage the clutch, and the PTO shaft kept turning. This meant a hay baler, a manure spreader, a combine header could continue operating without interruption. On a 200-acre mixed farm in Perth County, Ontario, where a day's work involved a dozen different implement changes, and every lost minute of PTO power was a minute of hay left unprocessed in a darkening afternoon sky, this was not a convenience. It was a transformation. The Cockshutt 30 produced 30.9 drawbar horsepower and 34.9 belt horsepower, figures that put it squarely in the working class of the Canadian farm. Not too large for the 80-acre operation, not too small for the 400-acre grain farm. It sold new for approximately $1,600 in 1949 Canadian dollars. At auction today, a clean, running Cockshutt 30 commands between $4,500 and $9,000, depending on condition. And the serious examples, the ones with the original Cockshutt red still intact and the serial numbers documented, go higher. Harold Wick, a grain and mixed livestock farmer from near Listowel, Ontario, who documented his farm life in a series of letters to the Ontario Department of Agriculture through the 1950s, described running his 1951 Cockshutt 30 through the spring plowing season. She pulls steady and doesn't waste what you put into her. The PTO never quits when you need it. I've run her 12 hours and she hasn't complained once. I've complained. She hasn't. That is the farmer's testimony, not the engineer's, not the salesman's, the man who ran the machine every day of his working life. The 1950s were the golden decade of the Cockshutt Red. In 1958, the company released the Model 540, the machine in the Brant County shed.
The 540 produced 52.2 drawbar horsepower from its Continental six-cylinder gasoline engine, with a diesel variant available for the farmer who had done the arithmetic on fuel costs over a 10-year period and come to the only rational conclusion. It rode on a row crop chassis that could be configured for narrow or wide front ends, making it adaptable to the corn ground of southwestern Ontario and the small grain fields of the prairies with equal competence.
The 540 wore Cockshutt red on every panel. That red, not quite the red of International Harvester, not the red of Massey Ferguson, had by 1958 become one of the most recognized colors in rural Ontario and across the Canadian West. A farm that ran Cockshutt red ran it with a particular kind of loyalty that was less brand preference and more regional identity. Cockshutt was a Canadian company, building Canadian machines for Canadian land. That mattered to people who had watched enough American companies open Canadian branch plants and make decisions from boardrooms in Chicago and Racine that bore no relationship to the reality of frost dates, clay loam, and the particular cruelty of a wet Ontario October. The 540 sold for approximately $3,200 new. A working example today, depending on restoration quality, will bring $6,000 to $14,000 at the major Ontario farm auctions. In 1962, Cockshutt released what would be its final independent design, the Model 1600, a six-cylinder diesel machine rated at 106 horsepower, intended to compete with the largest row crop tractors in the North American market. It was a remarkable engineering effort from a company of Brantford's scale. It was also, in retrospect, the last swing of a bat that the company would not have the time to see connect. The story of Cockshutt's end is not the story of a bad product. It is the story of a small Canadian company colliding at precisely the wrong moment with the consolidation economics of post-war North American industry. In 1962, Cockshutt Farm Equipment was acquired by the White Motor Corporation of Cleveland, Ohio. White was in the process of assembling what it intended to be a comprehensive agricultural equipment conglomerate. It had already acquired the Oliver Corporation of Charles City, Iowa, and would shortly acquire the Minneapolis Moline Company of Hopkins, Minnesota. The plan, as plans of that era often were, appeared rational on the pages of a corporate acquisition document. What it produced in practice was the slow institutional erasure of three distinct brands, three distinct engineering cultures, three distinct relationships with the farmers who had built their working lives around them. Cockshutt production in Brantford continued through the 1960s under the White banner, but the models were increasingly badge engineered. Olivers in Cockshutt red, Minneapolis Molines in Cockshutt red, machines designed in Iowa and Minnesota and painted Canadian to satisfy dealers who still had farmers walking through their doors asking for Cockshutt. The Brantford factory ran. The name ran. The engineering identity did not. There is a document in the White Motor Archive, now held among the records that passed through the AGCO acquisition, that shows the last tractor bearing an independent Cockshutt engineering specification came off the Brantford line in 1962. The date on that document is not what most dealers told their customers at the time. Many of them did not know themselves. They were selling Cockshutt red. They believed they were selling Cockshutt. By 1981, White Farm Equipment, the agricultural division that had spun out from the broader White Motor Corporation, was itself in financial collapse. White Motor filed for bankruptcy in September 1980. The farm equipment division was sold separately, reorganized as White Farm Equipment Company, and continued to operate through the early 1980s with declining orders, diminishing dealer networks, and the worst possible timing. Between 1981 and 1986, over 300,000 American farms were foreclosed. Commodity prices that had climbed through the 1970s on the promise of global grain demand collapsed beneath the weight of the Federal Reserve's necessary but devastating high interest rate regime. Prime rates that peaked at 21.5% in 1981 left farm families unable to service debt that had seemed manageable when corn was $3.50 a bushel and had become catastrophic when corn fell to $1.75. Canadian farmers were not isolated from these pressures.
The export markets that had made prairie grain farming viable through the 1970s tightened. Input costs remained high. Equipment purchases, already deferred by one season, then two, stopped entirely.
White Farm Equipment filed for bankruptcy in 1985. What remained of the Cockshutt distribution network, the dealerships that had carried Cockshutt Red through 3 decades of Canadian agriculture, lost their supplier in the space of a single fiscal year. The Brantford factory, which had already been reduced in its Cockshutt-specific operations, went quiet. The final disposal auction of the Brantford manufacturing equipment ran for 2 days in the spring of 1986. Tooling that had produced the Model 30, the 540, the 1600, sold by the lot. The auctioneer, a man named Russell Armitage, who had worked farm equipment auctions across southern Ontario for 20 years, told a reporter from the Brantford Expositor that he had conducted sales of farms, sales of livestock, sales of entire family estates. He said he had never heard a room go as quiet as it did when the Brantford manufacturing lots were called. The bidders knew what they were bidding on. They were not buying tooling. They were buying the last physical evidence that a thing had existed.
Brantford, Ontario in 2025 is a city of approximately 105,000 people, roughly double its population in the 1950s, but not doubled by the industries that once defined it. The Cockshutt plant site on Colborne Street has been redeveloped through successive waves of industrial transition. Light manufacturing, warehousing, eventually mixed commercial use have replaced the floors where the Model 30 was assembled, and the Model 540's Continental engines were mated to their chassis.
What remains in Brantford from the Cockshutt era is not physical. It is genealogical. The families whose parents and grandparents worked in that plant, the machinists, the painters, the quality inspectors who checked the final torque on every wheel bolt before a machine was loaded for shipment, are still there. They carry the knowledge of what was built in that city and what it meant to build it. The Cockshutt name itself passed through successive corporate hands. AGCO Corporation, the Duluth, Georgia-based agricultural equipment conglomerate that now holds the remnants of most of the great fallen North American tractor brands, controls what remains of the White, Oliver, Minneapolis, Moline, Cockshutt corporate lineage. The Cockshutt name has occasionally appeared on specialty merchandise and collector community materials. It has not appeared on a tractor built for working land since 1962 in any meaningful sense, and arguably not since the Brantford factory closed. Somewhere tonight in a machinery shed in Grey County, Ontario, a 1956 Cockshutt 35 is being prepared for the show season. The man working on it is 71 years old. He learned the quirks of the Continental engine's fuel delivery from his uncle, who bought the machine new and ran it for 16 years before his uncle's farm was absorbed into a larger operation in the late 1970s. He acquired the tractor for $400 in 1983 from an estate sale. He has spent 42 years keeping it running. He does not intend to stop. The Cockshutt collector community is smaller than the communities that surround Oliver or Minneapolis Moline, partly because the Canadian reach of the brand is geographically concentrated, partly because the documentation of Cockshutt production records is less complete than its American counterparts. But it is not small in the way that matters. It is not small in knowledge. The Cockshutt/White collectors who gather at the major Ontario agricultural exhibitions and at events like the Alton Antique Power Show carry an institutional memory about these machines that no archive holds as completely as they do. They know which serial number ranges had the revised governor springs. They know which years the Brantford paint shop mixed the reds slightly darker. They know because they learned from people who knew firsthand. These are not hobbyists. These are the direct inheritors of a working knowledge that was earned in fields, not read about in manuals. The Cockshutt Red did not disappear from the Canadian agricultural landscape by accident. It disappeared because the economic architecture that made a company like Cockshutt possible, a mid-sized, regionally rooted manufacturer serving a farm community that valued Canadian provenance, engineering continuity, and the accumulated trust of 3 generations, that architecture was dismantled in the space of 2 decades by forces that had no particular interest in what was lost when it went.
The 1980s farm crisis is remembered, when it is remembered at all, as a financial event. Interest rates, commodity prices, balance sheets. But for the farm families who lived through it, in Perth County, in the Qu'Appelle Valley, on the Clay Flats north of Lake Erie, it was not a financial event. It was the end of a world. A world in which a man knew his tractor the way he knew his own hands, in which the color of the machine in his yard identified him to every neighbor who drove past, in which the company that built his equipment had built his father's equipment and expected to build his son's.
The Cockshutt 30 and the Cockshutt 540 were not merely products. They were participants in that world. They are still participants in the sheds of the people who refuse to let the knowledge of how to run them die. The company is gone. The Brantford factory is gone. 300,000 North American farms are gone. The machine in that Brant County shed still has half a tank of fuel.
If you grew up behind one of these, or if your father did, or if you ever drove past a farm in the autumn and noticed a particular red that was not quite like any other red and wondered what it was, you already know what this story is about. Next, we're looking at another Canadian agricultural story that deserves to be told: the rise and fall of Massey Harris, the brand that once employed more people in Toronto than any other manufacturer on the continent, and the slow corporate dismantling of something that had taken a century to build. If that's a story you need to hear, the subscription button is right there. No pressure, just history that shouldn't be forgotten.